a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, as is Scott Fugger. We previously discussed Marvel Unlimited way back when. I believe we determined it was episode 30, and today we're actually going to be talking about Runaways, which is a Marvel comic book that I think ended up taking off in ways that some people weren't expecting. And we are talking about the initial run that began in 2003 and ran through September 2004. There are 18 issues, and it's definitely not the norm for your Marvel comics. Wouldn't you agree, Scott?
Yeah, it's definitely, just the fact that it introduced like 6 major all new characters. I think that that's pretty notable in itself for sure.
6 characters, 1 dinosaur.
Very true.
But to get some quick details out of the way here, Brian K. Vaughan and Adrian Alphona, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, were the creators of this series. So they came up with the concept, came up with the characters and everything like that. Because, like you said, Scott, these were all new characters. And if you look at it in a broader respect, too, they created a lot of characters for this because each kid has their parents involved in what they called the Pride. So you have a large amount of characters being introduced in this, actually. And, you know, I don't know if you have watched the Hulu show, but they changed things up a little in that. And if you enjoy the comics, I would still definitely recommend checking the show out, too, if you haven't yet.
Yeah, definitely plan on it. I was thinking I'll at least make it through the end of the Brian K. Vaughan stuff. So
Yeah.
like the 24 issues of the next volume, but then I'll probably give it a go.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and dive right on in and talk about the characters. I want to start with the kids specifically because they obviously drive the story even more than the parents do. You know, the parents are a very important piece of the story, but the kids are really the ones that you want to sort of spend time with and focus on when you're reading this. And I think this first series does a pretty nice job of just breaking down what each kid is capable of. And some have powers, some don't.
I think it was a really good, sort of introduction to all the characters and kind of like an extended origin story, where the first few issues is them, figuring out why they want to be like superheroes because their parents are, they witnessed their parents murdering like an innocent teenager basically. And then like through the next few issues, it's them kind of putting together the story of why their parents did this, and along the way kind of realizing figuring out what their powers are.
Absolutely. And we even get a look at what the kids are capable of, the ones who don't have the powers or a staff or anything like that. You know, Alex is all brains pretty much. He likes to be strategic and he plans very far in advance, which we will get to more on that later. But you have Alex, Nico, Molly, Carolina, Gertrude, and Chase. So they've basically been friends for many years. You know, their parents have been part of the Pride for so long that the kids were sort of just forced together. And even though they pretend they didn't like hanging out with each other, they ended up enjoying themselves enough to sort of build this trust over the years.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of one of my favorite parts, was kind of seeing how their relationship had previously developed and how it like continued to develop. Because like you said, at first they're kind of all like, oh, we have to go to this stupid charity event for our parents every single year. Oh, I don't want to be forced to hang out with these people. But then, as time goes on, you kind of see that, they know each other a little bit better than they let on. They're a little bit like closer to each other than they let on. And that kind of allows those relationships between them to kind of be naturally sped up a bit as they go through what they're going through.
Absolutely. It's one of those things where you see that they're sort of still growing on each other, even as these 18 issues unfold, because, you know, they would see each other, but it never felt like they hung out all the time. It was basically this yearly thing where their parents would get together and they would all just go hang out in the game room, which the Wilders have a pretty nice game room, gotta admit.
For sure, yeah. I'm jealous of all those arcade cabinets they got going on in there.
Right. But to touch on the parents too, they're all very successful in very different ways. So it's somewhat more likely that the parents would have come across each other in their adventures of going to things like charity galas and, all those things that rich people do that you and I probably aren't aware of even. And you can tell that there's some strategy in place with them too, just based on what all of their specialties are. And, you have them doing this terrible, terrible thing, but their reason for doing it is to save their children. So it's like, yeah, I get that. I guess that's kind of noble, but not really, because you're ruining literally everything else.
And I mean, it comes out in the end that like they the original intention wasn't to save their children. It was kind of all for their own gains,
Right.
the prospect of living in eternity and being these kind of all-powerful beings a little bit. And then it was kind of the kids. One couple had kids, and it threw a little bit of a wrench in the works.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, maybe you should have discussed this a little more if you didn't want kids in the picture. And it seemed like they had somewhat discussed it, but didn't really make any set rule about it. So then it was like, well, one of the couples is going to have a kid, so now we all have to have kids. And I was like, okay, that makes sense, I guess. Not really.
Yeah, I know. I would have almost expected people to fall more, especially these characters, to fall more on the selfish end, where it's like, well, I'm not gonna have a kid and decrease my chance. I'm gonna maybe use one of their kids as a sacrifice next year.
Yeah, and because this was the very first volume of these characters, you don't have a ton of time to spend diving into their past. 18 issues is a lot still for a run. I actually kind of wish more comics would sort of fall in that 12 to 18 issue range of telling sort of just this complete story. And one could argue that this story isn't technically complete because they do bring it back in 2005 with more issues from the creators, which is nice. But I feel like as far as this story arc goes, it's like, okay, these things all happened in a row, and that's how we got to the end of this. And I'm totally fine with things sort of leaving you in cliffhanger mode.
Yeah, I mean, I think as like a one-off, story as a whole, it, does kind of everything that it needed to. And if it hadn't ended up, kind of getting the cult-like status that it ended up getting, I think, it still would have been a good piece of work just on its own on this first volume. But I definitely do see like why that kind of cult status kind of became, and allowed it to flourish into, I think they're up to like they're on a fourth volume or fourth or fifth like run now. And I've only read this one so far, but I can really see how there's that potential for these characters to continue to blossom and be developed. Actually, one of the interviews that I read that was or skimmed through that was cited on Wikipedia, Brian K. Vaughan said that for like his other series, Why the Last Man and Ex Machina, and I know this was pre-Saga, but I know for Saga 2, he's saying how he has planned endings in his head, and he knows how it's going to end, and he knows what he's working towards, and that's kind of the goal. But with this series, the goal was more to create these characters and to allow future writers to take them in to different directions and continue to develop their story, which I think that makes a lot of sense looking at these issues. And like one of my kind of little qualms about it was I feel like there wasn't quite the character development that I wanted. And I'm wondering, now that I read that, I'm wondering if that's kind of part of the point, is leaving it more open-ended, so that these both him in the future and other writers that he knows or that he hopes are going to take the helm, giving them a little more wiggle room rather than having these like finite character traits that are kind of less malleable.
It's as if the story didn't really have time for that character development that you were hoping for, because what they witness is such a big deal to the point where they just go on the run and they're taking things day by day and they're sort of just winging it, even though we find out maybe not winging it quite as much as we thought at the beginning. But you have all of these things happening so fast that it's like you don't have that sort of time to sit down and just hang out with these characters really and get to know them better. But I think you get just enough of each of their personalities to figure out, you know, generally what you need to know about them in order for the story to work. And I think obviously now having 5 volumes, the current one is still ongoing, I believe, from Rainbow Rowell, I'm not really sure, and Chris Anka. They are doing a more sort of grown-up version of Runaways from what I've heard. I haven't read it yet, but I do agree with you that it kind of lets the other creators take these characters and do something a little different with them. They can't be running away 100% of the time, so that things have to slow down at some point. And I think, we've discussed diving into the 2005 series just to see where Brian K. Vaughan ended up taking this after they were able to revive it later. But I think as far as just establishing everything and the story that they give us, it's interesting because it leaves you wanting to know more about these characters. And I think that's what makes it so effective. It's like, okay, here's this crazy thing that happened, and that's sort of all we're going to give you for now.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you kind of hit on this a little bit. Like, as readers, we don't really have the chance to, dive in to who they are personally on like a micro level. But also, they don't have the chance because it's kind of, they saw their parents murdering someone, and then eventually they find out like their parents are essentially trying to end the human race, I guess. So that, the stakes are super high for them, and you know they don't have their own chance to process it and figure out kind of like what it means for them. The obvious exception would be Alex, if you want to go there.
Yeah, we can certainly talk about the twist in a bit, but a little more on the story. This takes place on the West Coast, so it's taken you out of the East Coast Marvel world. Yes, there were the West Coast Avengers and everything like that, and that's even brought up in here, how there's an old West Coast Avengers storage place and everything like that. And I do like that within the story they do tie things into the MCU, and obviously you get the big Captain America appearance later on towards the end of the run here, but they just give you these little tidbits along the way, and you're like, okay, so they do exist in this same world. It's not like they're putting them on the West Coast just because they want to pretend that all of the heroes in New York don't exist.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to like that whole kind of like creating a whole new like world within the world, and like this whole new set of characters, and really, giving them the space to kind of like discover themselves and flourish. I think, in that way the setting makes a lot of sense for sure.
Plus, because of how rich all of their parents are, it's like, yes, you have a lot of rich people in New York and they could have a brownstone or something, but I feel like just seeing a bunch of brownstones wouldn't be nearly as effective as their big sprawling mansions that you see and all of the land that comes with that.
Definitely. I mean, they need somewhere to run away to, and be. I mean, I guess technically, in some ways, it'd be easier in New York since it would, take forever to search every single building and stuff. But there's a lot more room for them to run
Run.
away to, and
Yeah.
uh, the sort of hideout that Chase has isn't really something that would exist in New York.
Oh, absolutely not. There's just no real place for that. And, obviously you have Central Park and everything like that. But there are so many people going through there all the time. It's like you can't really hide there.
Yeah, I mean, also if you add the fact that Alex's parents have them framed for murder and have the police looking out for them,
Yeah.
that would be a lot harder to avoid suspicion in New York when it's plastered all over the TV screens and billboards and everything. It's a lot easier to keep a lower profile in California where they are.
Now I just imagine all of the Times Square screens being covered with their faces. It's like, yeah, you're not really going to escape that. I know we want to dive into the twist a little more too, because I think that is a crucial turning point in this series. And I like that they hold on to it for so long. Everything has happened. And because we're reading a comic book too, one of the things I've realized when I was rereading this, it's like we have absolutely no clue who it is because all we get is a note and we don't hear the voices like you would in a TV show. You can't tell if it's a guy or a girl or anything like that. So it adds more to the mystery in this format, I think. And that's very helpful because if you hear a voice, one, they'd have to have some sort of voice distortion to really just keep the mystery going. But if we heard that it was a guy and you know that Alex and Chase have pretty different voices, it's like, all right, well, there's no fun in that. So I think using that as a tool in the comic is a really nice move because there's absolutely no indication of who it could be until it's revealed.
Yeah, I think it was really effective. I mean, and I think they kind of put little hints in there here and there that, I feel like when they set up like the parent-child relationships, it seemed like, Alex and Nico and Chase were kind of the ones more at odds with their parents. And then like Carolina and Molly seemed to be the ones that were kind of closer to their parents. And, you know, when they showed the note, it was kind of just a very generic handwriting. So it definitely, I feel like there were certain assumptions that at least I made towards who it would be, and then, but kind of without any real evidence. So it was definitely a major surprise to me once it was actually revealed.
So who did you initially think it was?
I was definitely leaning more towards Molly or Carolina.
Okay.
What about you?
I don't really recall when I first read it, but I probably leaned more towards Carolina just because, like you said, the others had so much tension with their parents, but Carolina was defending them every step of the way. And one of the parents actually pointed out that, could you really believe that it's the 11-year-old who has figured all this out and is the mole? So I think that kind of would make some people think it could be Molly, but in a sense, just the way she was acting the entire time and wanting to put on a costume and everything, she was too juvenile in my mind to be able to do that. It's like, okay, does this 11-year-old even know how to use a payphone or something, Because it's not like they took all of their stuff with them when they ran away.
Very true. Yeah, and I think now that I'm remembering it, I think the first note that they found was when they initially were helping Molly escape, and that was when she found out she was a mutant, and I'm pretty sure she passed out, so she wouldn't really have been able to be the one who left the note. Now that I think about it a little more.
But there's just so much detail in this to where it's hard to not only keep track of everything, but you just need to blatantly be told how this twist came to be, because when we find out that it's Alex, then we sort of have the other characters unravel it for us. It's like, oh, so that's why you wanted to go back to your house. Oh, that's why you went to the bathroom when we were getting food and everything like that. So they piece it together for you after the fact. And I like that the clues weren't too obvious either. I feel like that would not have been nearly as impactful as it was because honestly, I didn't really remember too much about the twist. And I think that's partially because I have since watched the show, which takes a slightly different approach to some things. I don't want to give everything away for you because I know you still have to watch it. And I have not watched season 2 yet. So I'm not even caught up on the show. But, because I made that comment earlier about if they just call, it would be pretty easy to pinpoint who it was in the TV show. So there are things like that that need to be worked around. And it's just interesting how many things you can do in the comic book format that you can't do anywhere else, because not only are you getting these written cues, but you still have visual cues without giving too much away.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I also think that, typically if, you're reading like a mystery or like watching a mystery movie or something like that, it's like, you're kind of trying to figure out, who did it, whatever, stuff like that. And usually there's kind of clues that, you can figure out if you're trying hard enough. I almost feel like it maybe should have been a little bit more frustrating, the fact that there were so few clues for this. But I think it also, made the twist that much more effective because there wasn't any sort of like definitive answer beforehand as to, who it could be.
Absolutely. Were you not only surprised when it was Alex, but did you immediately see why it was Alex?
Yeah, I mean, the very first issue, the first like scene is him, playing video games online and talking to who he's playing with and saying like, he's like the tactical brains behind it
Yeah.
and plotting and figuring out like kind of like the battle strategy and stuff. So, once it was revealed, it's like kind of like one of those scenes in a movie where like where your memories all come rushing back at you, and you're like, oh, he's like the reason that they saw the sacrifice. He like, which is the whole reason any of this happened. So it like totally, once that piece falls into place, it's like, okay, everything kind of falls into place, and it's like, okay, yeah, so he figured it out the year before, and he's been planning ever since how to, bring everyone else into this.
And that says a lot for a high school kid, too. I don't know how strategic you were in high school, but for me, it was just like, okay, here's another day. Definitely not planning a year ahead.
For sure, yeah, and I mean, he's kind of the one without a physical power, so, I mean, it makes sense that he's kind of, the brains behind the whole thing, both when you're looking at the team as they were forming, it made a lot of sense, and then once the big reveal comes, it makes sense on that other level that he's the one behind everything.
Yeah, I want to dive into the writing and the art for the series because I think those are very important. But first, do you have a favorite character out of the kids at least?
I think my first, immediate first impressions, my favorite character is probably Nico. Um,
Okay.
I definitely had that emo phase and that super, mall emo phase in middle school. So it definitely just on the surface level appeals to me. And then, I think the staff of one, her power, is kind of one of the most impressive out of all of them. So on that level, it definitely appeals to me as well.
I actually want to quickly touch a little more on Nico too, because, basically they're sort of promoting self harm as her way of being able to use her powers. And I think that was something that was somewhat controversial at the time. I don't know if it was this huge thing, but I do remember hearing a little bit about that. And I think that was something that they felt they had to change for the show just because, it's meant to sort of be a more kid-friendly show. And I don't think having Nico cut herself every time she wants to use the staff of one would send a great message out to people, especially, in 2017 when people are talking more about mental health and everything like that. So it's definitely something that you could see making sense for 2003, but not necessarily in 2017, even when they relaunched the series and did the Hulu show.
Yeah, I don't know if I even necessarily like kind of thought of that as it was happening, but I mean, it makes sense that it would be kind of skirted around a bit. I think at least the 4 or 5 situations that I can remember um, from the series, it was kind of like more she was getting injured and stuff. But I could see how, that could become problematic in the future when she's trying to more like summon it rather than it
Right.
having it like being as a result of them being in a battle.
Yeah, because the thing is, she has to bleed in order for it to come out. And you have that somewhat funny moment though where she's telling old Lace to bite her and she has to order the dinosaur to do it because, or threaten Gert in order for the dinosaur to do it because, she's just trying to get the staff out, and Gert was like, well, why didn't you just lead with that sort of thing? And I think Gert is one of my favorite characters from the series, not only in this but possibly in the show too, because she's sort of the outsider more so than the rest in the sense because she is very, very opinionated, and I think even within the group that gets her in a little trouble, whereas everyone else is, despite Nico's emo phase, is sort of relatively normal, and Gert is all about the rights of pretty much everything, and she gets herself in trouble by talking a little too much at times, especially at the end there when they go to face the parents face to face. And I sort of just enjoyed what I was able to get from her personality in this.
Yeah, I think she would definitely be like my second favorite of the group. I think like I really like kind of like her attitude, and like you said, kind of like the outsiderness of it. It kind of adds, a little bit of, kind of like resistance within the group, where she's more like, we gotta let go of our parents totally and, be totally on our own and stuff like that. And then the other ones are kind of figuring out their situation more. It's a little kind of like less black and white for them. And I think it adds another good dynamic to the group.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive into the writing and the art on the series, because that's something that obviously drives a lot of this story. And I really liked both the writing style and the art style on this, because as I've been reading more and more comics, Brian K. Vaughan is a writer who I've constantly been reading, basically. I loved Y the Last Man. I read this and enjoyed it. I started Saga and I've enjoyed that. It's like kind of no matter what he seems to do, I end up enjoying it. And he does so many different types of stories too. Runaways isn't all that similar to Saga at all, I would say. Maybe a little more similar to Y the Last Man in the sense of all of the traveling that has to be done in both series. But otherwise, I just think his character work is very specific. He knows when to give you just bits here and there and when to give you more information. And I think, if we do the 2005 series, that's something we might see happen. And I can't recall if I've actually read that full run. I know it's 30 issues, but Vaughn and Alfana are on 24 of the 30 issues, so I will have to check and see. I know, when we did our Marvel Unlimited episode, we can't remember if they had implemented the little check mark to show you what comics you've read or not, but they do it now, so.
Yeah, Brian K. Vaughan's definitely a favorite of mine as well. When I first started getting back into comics, like a couple of years ago now, I guess it is, I went to a comic book store and I was like, these are the comics I like. Do you have any suggestions? And they were like, here, like, grab Saga Volume 1, give that a shot. And then from there, I think at that point there were like the 2 hardcovers out of, which is like not quite an omnibus, but it's like 3 or 4 volumes in one. So I bought those right away, right after finishing the first volume. And I guess kind of similar to the twist with Alex in here, I know Saga is definitely known for killing off fan favorite characters and creating a major ruckus over that. So that's definitely an interesting similarity I see. And I guess Saga and this are now the only 2 Brian K. Vaughan stuff I've read, but Y the Last Man's definitely on my dock for some time soon. And I can just tell like how, besides just the fact that he's super popular, like he's really an amazing writer. And and I think that's also why I was kind of expecting a little bit more depth as far as like the character development. So I'm really excited to see in the next run of Runaways how that continues to progress as well.
Yeah, quick fun fact for you: Why the Last Man is going to be coming to FX, but I think it might not arrive until 2020, so you have plenty of time to read those comics as well, because there are quite a few in that one. It's a hefty amount of reading to do, but it's totally worth it. And I know you have quite a few notes on the art that I had not realized about this, so I will let you speak to those.
Yeah, I actually just kind of saw it at the top of the Wikipedia page just before we started recording, but apparently this was originally published through a Marvel imprint called Tsunami, and the goal was to bring in new readers, like especially like younger readers and fans of manga, Japanese comics, and I think that makes the art direction make a lot more sense for me because it's kind of a little bit like I feel like it's a little bit less detailed, a little bit more two-dimensional, and it has I really like the color palette though. It's kind of like I feel like it's kind of like subdued colors a little bit. But yeah, so the in that way, talking about like the manga and the younger readers, I think that makes the artwork make a lot more sense. And then I also thought it was really interesting that these were originally published as digest sized rather than like the typical trade paperback, which is
Okay.
that's probably what like an 8 by 10 ish, closer to that. The digest size is a 5 by 7, which is like the size of like manga typically. So I can imagine that would be much different. Like I can't imagine like reading an American comic in that size. It seems so foreign to me. Pun not intended, but I think if I read it again, like taking that into account, I might look at things a little bit differently as well. And I just thought it was pretty interesting.
I kind of want to know what these looked like now, because I have only ever, one, read it on Marvel Unlimited, and two, seen the actual trade paperback sizes for it. So that's interesting. I would be curious to know if it's something they still print or if they only print them as trade paperbacks now, because if they don't print those sizes anymore, that's sort of like a really great collector's item to have for this series that seems to sort of just keep getting more popular every time someone's introduced to it. And this is sort of one of my go-to recommendations, I would say, for people who want something to dive into on Marvel Unlimited but don't want to be overwhelmed necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's a really good fit for that because, it doesn't come with all the baggage of knowing that, oh, Spider-Man's been going for over like half a century and, like there's kind of a bit of a barrier to entry with other Marvel like titles because, you know, especially with like some of the bigger ones like Spider-Man and stuff, there's a kind of assumed knowledge of the character's past. Um, which isn't really necessary with these.
Absolutely. It's like the Matt Fraction Hawkeye series. Yes, Hawkeye has been an Avenger and everything like that, but you don't need to have any of that background really to dive into that series. And I really like when things are more contained like this, but like I mentioned earlier, they have nods to the larger Marvel universe. And I want to dive into some final thoughts here because we did not touch on Cloak and Dagger showing up yet. And that's another duo that have made their way to the small screen. Cloak and Dagger is a show on Freeform right now, and actually I think today they announced when the second season would premiere, but they aren't your biggest heroes showing up like Captain America did, but they still have this role that sort of makes you understand, okay, this is the situation we have on the West Coast, and this is who is going to come deal with it. And they run into their own issues along the way. And I sort of just like that they didn't feel the need to bring all of the Avengers in. Even the Captain America appearance didn't feel too overdone.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Captain America appearance almost was a little bit more like a cameo. And I think the Cloak and Dagger, it made sense because, these are teenage runaways, and that's kind of what Cloak and Dagger are as well. So there was, that sort of feeling of kinship between the two. And I think that, you know, I think it worked really well.
Absolutely. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to discuss?
We pretty much hit on everything. I'm just excited to continue to read the next volume and see where it takes us.
Yeah, and the next one is actually the longest one, I believe, because volume 3 is 14 issues. Volume 4 was only 4 issues, and I think that volume was more of an event tie-in. So you have these 4 issues that sort of tie into something larger, and the current volume 5, I have no idea what their plans are for that or how long it's going to go, but it's something where just by looking at the first issue, I was like, okay, I want to check this out, but I need to read the other stuff first. Gotta kind of go in order here. And like I said, I don't recall if I've read volume 2 of it, but I'll probably find out once I dive into it again. And like I said, Scott, you are more than welcome to come back on to talk about that one if you're interested.
For sure, I'll be happy to.
Awesome. Well, thank you for talking about the 2003 Volume 1 with me. And to our listeners, you can follow the podcast at Geekdom Pod on Twitter. Welcome to Geekdom on Instagram. And we do have a Facebook page, but that's not as fun as Twitter or Instagram right now. So there is that. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.